They were masterpieces of metal and fire, celebrated in posters, praised in speeches, and feared in whispers. These planes were built to dominate the skies of World War II, but some were so lethal, so unstable, so unforgiving that even the men who flew them felt a chill before takeoff. A single mistake, one wrong angle, 1 second too slow, and the aircraft meant to protect them became their executioner. Pilots prayed not just for victory, but to survive their own machines. These were not just fighters. They were flying weapons that pushed human limits, devoured rookies, and demanded perfection or blood. Tonight, we are not counting kills. We are counting fear. This is the story of 10 World War II planes so deadly, even their pilots feared them. War does not begin with explosions. It begins with decisions. In the years before World War II, engineers, generals, and governments across the world stared upward and reached the same conclusion. The next war would be decided in the sky. Whoever controlled the air would control the battlefield below. Cities, factories, fleets, armies, everything would live or die at the mercy of aircraft. So nations raced to build fighters that were faster, stronger, and deadlier than anything humanity had ever flown. What they created changed warfare forever. But there was a truth buried beneath the propaganda posters and victory claims. A truth pilots rarely spoke aloud. Some of these planes were too deadly. Not just to the enemy, to the men inside them. By the late 1930s, aviation technology was advancing at a pace never seen before. Every new model demanded more speed, more firepower, more altitude, more range. Engineers shaved weight wherever they could, reinforced frames to survive combat stresses, and strapped increasingly powerful engines to airframes that were often pushed far beyond their original limits. The result was a generation of fighter planes that were astonishingly lethal, but also brutally unforgiving. They stalled without warning. They snapped into spins too fast to recover. They overheated, caught fire, tore their own wings off in steep dives. And once airborne, there was no margin for error. A rookie pilot who made a single mistake, too much throttle on takeoff, too sharp a pull during a climb, one misjudged landing, could be killed without ever seeing the enemy. These aircraft demanded perfection. And in wartime, perfection was rare. World War II forced thousands of young men into cockpits after only weeks of training. Teenagers barely old enough to vote were handed machines capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, armed with cannons powerful enough to shred aircraft in seconds. Many pilots feared combat, but many feared their own aircraft even more. Because the enemy might miss. The plane never did. History remembers the legends, the aces with dozens of kills, the aircraft credited with air superiority, the sleek silhouettes frozen in black and white photographs. But history often forgets the quieter statistics, the training accidents, the mechanical failures, the unexplained crashes that happened far from the battlefield. In some air forces, more pilots were lost to accidents than to enemy fire. And behind every statistic was a name, a face, a family who received a telegram that said nothing more than, killed during a routine flight. No enemy, no glory, just a machine that turned lethal without warning. This is not a list of the most famous planes. It is a reckoning. A look at 10 World War II aircraft so dangerous, so extreme in design, that they inspired dread in the men who flew them. Aircraft that killed enemies efficiently, but often exacted a terrible price from their own side. These planes won battles. They shifted the balance of air power. They shaped the outcome of the war. But they also exposed the brutal truth of technological warfare. Progress does not care who it kills. The fear began before the engine even started. Pilots walked across rain-soaked runways toward aircraft that had already claimed lives, sometimes dozens, without ever facing the enemy. Ground crews whispered warnings. Instructors spoke carefully, choosing their words, knowing that confidence mattered, but silence could be fatal. "You must respect her," they said. "She'll kill you if you don't." Every aircraft had a personality. Some were gentle, forgiving. Others were predators from the moment the wheels left the ground. And the deadliest planes of World War II were often the most temperamental. Speed was the obsession of the era. A faster plane could choose when to fight and when to flee. It could climb above the enemy, dive through formations, and escape before retaliation. But speed came at a cost: thin wings, narrow landing gear, unstable aerodynamics. At high speeds, control surfaces stiffened. At low speeds, lift vanished. A moment of inattention during landing could send a fighter cartwheeling into the ground in a fireball. Some aircraft demanded landing speeds so high that even experienced pilots struggled to bring them down safely on short or damaged runways. Others had engines so powerful that torque alone could flip the aircraft on takeoff if the pilot wasn't perfectly aligned. These were not flaws. They were trade-offs. And in wartime, trade-offs were accepted. Firepower escalated just as aggressively. Early fighters carried light machine guns. By the middle of the war, cannons were standard: 20 millimeters, 30 millimeters, weapons capable of tearing bombers apart with a few hits. But heavier guns meant more weight, altered balance, violent recoil. Some aircraft shook so violently when firing that pilots lost aim. Others suffered structural stress that cracked frames or jammed control systems mid-combat. And when something failed at 20,000 feet, there was often no second chance. Altitude brought its own dangers. Aircraft pushed higher than ever before, chasing bombers into thin air where oxygen vanished and engines struggled to breathe. Pressurization was rare. Heating was minimal. Frostbite and hypoxia stalked pilots long before the enemy appeared. In some cockpits, temperatures dropped below freezing. Instruments iced over. Fingers numbed. A pilot who blacked out for even a few seconds could lose control and never wake up. Yet despite the danger, these planes kept flying. Because the war demanded it. Factories worked around the clock. Aircraft were rushed from blueprints to production lines with little time for refinement. Known flaws were documented and ignored because the front lines needed planes now, not perfect machines later. Pilots learned to adapt. They developed rituals. They memorized emergency procedures. They shared tips in mess halls and barracks: how to land without stalling, how to dive without tearing the wings off, how to coax an engine through one more mission. Survival depended on knowledge passed between men, not manuals. Some pilots bonded deeply with their aircraft, despite the fear. Others despised them. There were planes that pilots refused to fly unless ordered. Others earned grim nicknames, names that never appeared in official records but spread quickly through squadrons. The Widowmaker. The Flying Coffin. The Killer. When a plane earned such a name, it was never by accident. And yet, these aircraft were not failures. They were, in many cases, too successful. They pushed technology to the edge of what was possible with 1940s materials, fuels, and engineering knowledge. They achieved performance levels that astonished the world, but demanded a level of skill few could consistently deliver. The men who mastered them became legends. The men who didn't vanished into statistics. World War II aviation was not romantic in the cockpit. There was no soundtrack, no slow-motion heroism, just vibration, noise, heat, cold, fear, and split-second decisions made at lethal speeds. Pilots lived with the knowledge that death could come from anywhere, from above, below, behind, or from the machine wrapped around them. Every mission was a gamble, and for those flying the deadliest planes of the war, the odds were never even. This story is not about ranking aircraft by kill counts alone. It is about risk. Risk engineered into metal and rivets. Risk accepted by young men who climbed into cockpits knowing full well that the aircraft beneath them had already buried others. It is about the thin line between brilliance and disaster, the line these planes crossed again and again. Some of these aircraft were feared because they were unstable. Some because they demanded inhuman precision. Some because their performance masked lethal flaws until it was too late. But all of them shared one trait. They punished mistakes mercilessly. As we move forward, we will examine 10 aircraft that defined this deadly balance, planes that dominated the skies of World War II while quietly building reputations that haunted pilots long after the engines shut down. You will hear why experienced aces respected them, and why new pilots dreaded them. You will understand how design choices, battlefield pressure, and wartime urgency combined to create machines that were both triumphs and tragedies. And by the end, you may see World War II aviation not as a tale of glory, but as a relentless experiment paid for in blood. The fear did not come from ignorance. It came from experience. By the time these aircraft earned their reputations, pilots knew exactly what they were climbing into. They had seen the wreckage at the end of runways. They had attended funerals for men who never reached combat. They had read accident reports that ended with the same cold phrases: loss of control, structural failure, pilot error. Yet the war demanded fighters. And so they flew. What follows are not myths or exaggerations. These are 10 World War II fighter planes that earned victory in the air, but extracted a ruthless toll from the men who flew them. 1. Messerschmitt Me 262, the jet that arrived too early. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was a revolution wrapped in danger. It was the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds no Allied aircraft could touch. When it appeared over Europe in 1944, bomber crews were stunned. The Me-262 sliced through formations with terrifying speed, destroying heavy bombers almost at will. But for its pilots, the Me-262 was a constant gamble with death. The jet engines were fragile, unreliable, and dangerously slow to respond. Throttle movement had to be gentle, too fast, and the engine could flame out or explode. On takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable, Allied fighters waited like hunters. The aircraft's high landing speed turned runways into death traps. Any misjudgment meant disaster. The Me-262 also suffered from poor metallurgy. Germany no longer had access to high-quality alloys. Engines wore out after only a few hours of flight. Pilots feared combat less than they feared mechanical failure. The Me-262 was deadly because it was unstoppable in the air, but merciless to those who trusted it too much. 2. Mitsubishi A6M0, deadly until it wasn't. At the start of the war, the Zero was terrifying. Light, agile, and long-ranged, it outclassed almost every Allied fighter in the Pacific. Japanese pilots dominated early air battles, carving through opponents with ease. But the Zero achieved its performance by sacrificing protection. No armor. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A single hit could turn the aircraft into a fireball. As the war progressed and Allied tactics improved, Zero pilots found themselves flying a plane that could not dive fast, could not absorb damage, and could not escape modern fighters. Veteran Japanese pilots knew the truth. One mistake meant death. And replacements, often rushed through training, were placed into aircraft that punished inexperience brutally. Many never survived their first engagements. The Zero was deadly to the enemy, but utterly unforgiving to its pilots. Lockheed P-38 Lightning, power that demanded respect. The P-38 Lightning looked futuristic, and it was. Twin engines, heavy armament, and excellent high-altitude performance made it one of the most effective American fighters of the war. It excelled as an interceptor, escort, and ground attack aircraft. But it had a dark side. Early P-38s suffered from severe compressibility issues in high-speed dives. Pilots would push the nose down, then discover the controls locked solid. The aircraft continued diving, faster and faster, until impact. Many pilots died without understanding what had happened. Even after fixes were introduced, the Lightning remained complex and demanding. Engine management was critical. One mistake could lead to asymmetric thrust and loss of control. The P-38 rewarded skill, but punished carelessness without mercy. 4. Focke-Wulf FW-190, the killer that bit back. When the FW-190 entered service, Allied pilots were stunned. It was fast, heavily armed, and rugged. Against early Spitfires, it was dominant. German aces loved its firepower and roll rate. But the aircraft's powerful engine produced severe torque on takeoff. Novice pilots frequently lost control before even leaving the ground. Landing was equally dangerous. Poor visibility over the nose and narrow margins for error led to countless crashes. As Germany rushed pilots into service with minimal training, the FW-190's reputation darkened. It was no longer just killing enemies, it was killing its own. Veterans could tame it. Rookies rarely survived it. Vought F-4U Corsair, too much plane for the Navy. The Corsair was a beast. Massive engine. Enormous propeller. Unmatched speed for a carrier-based fighter. In combat, it was devastating, especially in the hands of U.S. Marine Corps pilots. But the Navy initially rejected it, because it was too dangerous to land on aircraft carriers. The long nose blocked visibility. The landing gear bounced violently. Pilots often slammed into decks, missed arresting wires, or cartwheeled into parked aircraft. Early Corsairs killed more pilots in training accidents than in combat. Only after extensive modifications and brutal experience did it become one of the most successful fighters of the Pacific War. The Corsair was deadly because it demanded mastery before mercy. Hawker Typhoon, power wrapped in fear. The Typhoon was built to intercept German fighters, but found its true calling as a ground attack monster. Fast at low altitude, heavily armed, and capable of carrying rockets, it terrorized German armor after D-Day. But early Typhoons were plagued by deadly flaws. Carbon monoxide leaks suffocated pilots. Structural failures caused tail sections to shear off mid-flight. Engines caught fire without warning. Pilots feared sudden death even in calm flight. Many squadrons lost aircraft without ever seeing the enemy. Only after years of fixes did the Typhoon become reliable, but its reputation never fully recovered. It was a weapon first, and a safe aircraft second. Yakovlev Yakin. Victory at a terrible cost. The Yak-9 was one of the most produced fighters of the war. Lightweight, agile, and well-suited to the brutal Eastern Front, it became a backbone of Soviet air power. But Soviet production realities were harsh. Materials were inconsistent. Quality control was uneven. Aircraft varied wildly in handling. Pilots reported sudden structural failures, engine problems, and unreliable systems. Training was minimal. Losses were accepted as inevitable. The Yak-9 killed enemies efficiently, but survival depended as much on luck as skill. In the East, pilots feared not just the Luftwaffe, but their own machines. 8. Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Survival through brutality. The P-47 was enormous, powerful, and nearly indestructible. It could absorb punishment that would destroy other fighters and still bring its pilot home. In combat, it was a killer, especially in dive attacks. But its size and weight made it unforgiving. Landing accidents were common. High-altitude operations were exhausting. The aircraft demanded strength and discipline. Early pilots struggled with its complexity. Mishandling the turbocharger or engine settings could be fatal. The Thunderbolt saved many lives, but only for pilots who learned its rules. 9. Messerschmitt Bf-109, a knife-edge fighter. The Bf-109 was the backbone of the Luftwaffe. Fast, deadly, and produced in enormous numbers, it fought from the opening days of the war until the final collapse of Germany. But it was a dangerous aircraft to fly. Narrow landing gear caused countless crashes. Torque on takeoff flipped planes onto their backs. Visibility was poor. As Germany lost experienced pilots, new recruits died in droves, often before combat. The Bf-109 did not forgive inexperience. And by the end of the war, inexperience was all Germany had left. 10. Bell P-39 Airacobra, a misunderstood killer. The P-39 was controversial. Rejected by many Allied pilots, it found success with the Soviets, who used it at low altitude where it performed best. But the Airacobra had unique dangers. Its mid-mounted engine and heavy cannon made it unstable in certain maneuvers. Spins were often unrecoverable. Pilots had to fly it precisely or not at all. Those who mastered it survived. Those who didn't disappeared. The pattern behind the fear. These aircraft were not failures. They were extremes. They pushed speed, power, and firepower to limits that human training and wartime conditions could barely support. They demanded pilots who did not exist in sufficient numbers. World War II forced men to learn in the air, or die learning. And these planes made that lesson unforgiving. Transition to the end. By 1945, the skies were filled with the ghosts of men who never finished training, never saw combat, never made it home. The planes remained icons of victory, symbols of technological triumph. But the fear they inspired never left the men who flew them. Because long after the engines cooled, pilots remembered one truth above all others. The enemy could be avoided. The enemy could be outflown. The enemy could miss. Their aircraft never did. When the war ended, the skies grew quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Airfields that once roared day and night fell silent. Runways cracked and faded under the sun. Hangars became storage sheds, museums, or ruins. The aircraft that had once ruled the air, those fierce, beautiful, terrifying machines, were scrapped, mothballed, or locked behind ropes and glass. To the world, they became history. To the pilots who survived them, they never stopped flying. Long after the shooting stopped, veterans still dreamed of engines screaming at full throttle, of cockpits shaking under impossible strain, of airframes shuddering as if they might tear themselves apart. They remembered the smell of oil and cordite, the sting of cold air, the constant awareness that one wrong movement could end everything. They remembered fear. Not the fear of the enemy, though that never vanished, but the deeper, quieter fear that lived inside the cockpit. The fear of trusting a machine that demanded perfection when war allowed none. These pilots were not reckless men. They were not thrill-seekers. They were professionals who understood exactly what they risked every time the wheels left the ground. And they flew anyway. History often celebrates machines. It lists specifications, top speeds, kill ratios, production numbers. But machines do not feel terror. Men do. The true cost of these aircraft is not measured in victories alone, but in the empty chairs in mess halls, the unclaimed bunks, the letters that stopped arriving. It is measured in the young pilots who never learned their aircraft's final lesson, because the lesson was always fatal. For every ace who mastered a deadly plane, there were dozens who never got the chance. The deadliest aircraft of World War II were not evil. They were honest. They revealed the limits of human endurance and training at a time when war demanded both be exceeded. They showed what happens when technology advances faster than safety, faster than understanding, faster than the men expected to control it. These planes were warnings written in metal. And the warnings were paid for in blood. In the aftermath of the war, aviation learned from these sacrifices. Designers added stability instead of shaving weight. Training became longer, deeper, safer. Test pilots replaced frontline pilots in discovering deadly flaws. Jets were refined. Cockpits became survivable. Mistakes became recoverable. The sky grew less lethal, not because planes became weaker, but because humanity finally respected the price of pushing too far, too fast. But none of that progress erases what came before. When we see these aircraft today, restored, polished, gleaming under museum lights, it is easy to forget what they were. They look calm, controlled. They are none of those things. They are frozen moments from an era when survival depended on courage, instinct, and luck in equal measure. When young men climbed into machines that had already killed their friends and trusted themselves to do better. Some did. Many did not. World War II aviation was not a golden age. It was a proving ground. A brutal one. Every deadliest plane on this list forced pilots to confront a terrible truth. Victory often comes before wisdom. And when it does, the cost is paid by those closest to the machine. These aircraft won wars, but they did not care who flew them. Perhaps that is why their stories still matter. Because they remind us that behind every technological triumph lies a human test. And when that test is failed, or rushed, or ignored, the consequences are written in lives, not numbers. The deadliest planes of World War II were not monsters because they killed. They were monsters because they demanded everything and gave nothing back. So when you hear the names spoken with admiration, remember the fear that accompanied them. Remember the pilots who tightened their harnesses, whispered a quiet prayer, and hoped their skill would be enough this time. Remember the ones who never returned. Because history remembers machines. But it is our responsibility to remember the men who survived them, and the many who did not. The sky, once again, is silent. And the planes that ruled it remain, unchanging reminders of a war that pushed human ambition to the edge, and sometimes beyond it. This was the story of 10 World War II planes so deadly, even their pilots feared them.